Okay, looks like it's 2:45 now, and we are live. So I'm going to go ahead and kick things off for us in this session. I'm Caitlin Regan-Quillhorst. I am the Director of Marketing Events for Technology First, and I get to introduce Chris. Chris has been moderating this track today, so now we get to reverse roles, and I'm no longer behind the scenes, so this is fun. Just want to thank our sponsors first, our diamond sponsors, Cincinnati State, our gold, Cadre and Checkpoint, and Okta. Our bronze sponsors, 8451, ComSpark, CDO Magazine, CyberRabbit, Dell, Exagrid, Extreme Networks, Franklin University, Gigamon, Nexagen, Sinclair, and Smart Data. And then also thank you to our annual partners, ATC, Evidence, CareSource, Cincinnati Bell, Google, Round Tower, Ahead, UD, Bright State, and Uptime Solutions. We cannot do this without your support. Thank you. So Chris Cole, right here, our Harry Potter fan, me as well. He is the Chief Information Security Officer / Chief Technology Officer at Dayton Children's Hospital. Mr. Cole has accumulated a wealth of knowledge, and as his career has spanned from entry-level help desk to network engineer and architect to cybersecurity architect and CISO, CTO for numerous U.S. organizations. He has participated on red and blue teams for medium to large organizations in Ohio. Mr. Cole holds a master's degree in information assurance and certifications for CISSP, CISM, 6 SANS, GIAC, and others. Join me in welcoming Chris Cole, Dayton Children's Hospital, as he discusses defense against the virtual dark arts. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Melissa. Melissa, oh my God. It's been a long day already. Thanks, Caitlin. So, today we're talking about defense, the virtual dark arts. So, my name is Chris Kuehl. I am the CISO and the CTO for Dayton Children's Hospital. I have over 21 years of experience in IT in one form or another, held several different engineering positions and several different architectural positions as well. I am married. I have 2 kids and 2 dogs. When I'm not busy being a free Uber driver to my kids, running them all over, I train and race in half Ironman and half marathons. And I do have a master's in information assurance and a few IT certifications. So in this session, we're going to go through virtual architectures, virtual attacks, past and present, defense against today's attacks, other virtual environments at risk, are there defenses for the other virtual environments, and then any questions that might come up. So the way that I do my presentations is I try to start out with the basics and assume that not everybody is an expert or a guru in this particular topic, so which would be virtualization. And then I want to make sure that everybody is kind of on the same starting point with terminology. And then my goal is to make sure that these are relevant, actionable, and worthwhile presentations. So let's, again, start out with some of the basics, right? We have virtual machines and we have virtual containers, or we have containers. So the big difference between virtual machines for both on-prem and in the cloud is you're virtualizing the entire server, right? You have your infrastructure, which is your physical hardware, your physical server, and then you install your host operating system. That could be Windows, Linux, VMware. And then on top of that, you run your hypervisor, right? Hyper-V, ESXi, NSX, Citrix hypervisor, any of those. And then you virtualize the entire server, like I said, and install the application on that virtual server. Again, that's the same for both on-prem as well as in the cloud. Containers are slightly different, similar concept, but instead of virtualizing the entire server, you're only virtualizing the application. And each of the applications in this diagram, app 1, 2, and 3, even though they're virtualized in their own separate containers, they all share the host operating system's kernel. So we're going to talk about both of those and a few other things throughout. So again, what are some examples of virtualization software? Hyper-V, VMware. Most people have heard of VMware, Citrix Hypervisor, Azure Virtual Machines, Red Hat virtualizations. So why are virtual machines being targeted? Well, it's because over 92% of businesses have adopted virtualization. And over the next 2 years, 45% of those plan to move their virtual environments into the cloud. Many organizations don't monitor what occurs on or between virtual machines on the same host. If you think about your infrastructure and your virtual machine environment, how many of you are running critical infrastructure components as a virtual machine, whether that's domain controller, file server, database servers? I would guess probably a very large part of us. And also from the cyber side, virtual machines are used for sandboxing so that we can take virtual images that are downloaded from potentially untrusted sites, attachments that users receive through phishing or through emails, and they're concerned that it might be a phishing attempt or malware. And also applications that some people aren't familiar with or haven't been approved to run in your environment. So virtual machines are used for many different things. So what are the goals for the malware specifically targeting virtual machines? From a cyber side, the main goal of the malware is to pass the inspection in the sandbox, right? They want to detect if it's a virtual environment and not execute and stay dormant. The malware also wants to evade antivirus detection. And if it can do all three of those, then it'll be installed in production and execute. Once it's installed in production, whatever it is, right, the application, the image, or the Word document or whatever the attachment is allowed to go back to the user in the production environment. Then the ultimate goal for malware starts to occur, to compromise the virtual machine, to compromise additional VMs, to compromise the host, and then eventually to compromise your entire environment. So just a quick history about how did we get to where we are today, right, when it comes to virtualization attacks. So in 2004, Joanna Rakowska, a Polish cybersecurity researcher, released code for a small application called the Red Pill. And it's named after the Matrix, and it works on various operating systems, Linux, Windows, VMware. It really didn't matter. It worked, and we'll talk about why shortly. Then in 2006, Joanna released the Blue Pill, which again, named after the Matrix. And what's interesting and important to know about the Blue Pill is that it was the first hypervisor rootkit. So just to level set, right? Hypervisor is the piece of software that runs between the host operating system and the guest operating system, and it acts almost like a traffic cop for physical resource allocation. And so a rootkit, right? Obviously, that is malware that is installed and not detectable, and it can hijack different things as they're accessing the physical hardware or interesting traffic like keystrokes. Then in 2009, VM hopping became a thing, and that allows an attacker to compromise a single virtual machine using whatever techniques they have available, and then be able to hop from one VM to another on the same host. And then in 2 slides, we're going to actually break down a very current attack vector for virtualization. So how did Red Pill, VM hopping, Blue Pill, and then the one that we're going to talk about, Ragnar Locker, how do those identify if it's in a virtual machine or running on a physical box? Well, there's 4 different ways So this is where we start to get a little bit more technical. The first way is the malware will sit and look at the virtual machine processes, the file system, or the registry. And if you think about it, right, virtual machines that are running in VMware, they have VM tools installed. So the malware will look for that specifically. There's also around 50 different references alone in the file system that refer back to VMware or Hyper-V specifically. And over 300 references in the registry, again, referring back to VMware and Hyper-V. So it's not very difficult for malware to be able to identify whether it's in a virtual machine or not. The second way that malware can identify if it's in a VM is it looks at the memory. There's over 1,500 references in the memory alone for the host operating system. And then there's also pointers to critical operating structures in the memory. So what's interesting about that is it doesn't matter what the host operating system is, because the virtual machine will have its critical structures in specific pieces or parts of RAM, and those are completely different than if it's on a physical box, and where the physical server will host its critical OS structures in its RAM. So malware will look and see, is there a pointer in memory for this specific piece of the operating system? If it is, then it can identify if it's a physical box or not. Virtual hardware, right? The malware is going to look for that E1000 VMware network card, or even all the way down to the anomalies about how the guest clock is updated, as compared to the physical host's clock. And then also specific processor instructions, which is what the red pill did. So what that is that malware, or the red pill, would push specific code into the processor specifically for virtualization, for virtual machines. And if the processor accepted that virtual code, then the red pill would identify that it was in a virtual machine. If the processor rejected that code, then the red pill would identify that it was a physical box. So if we break down what an attack looks like today against virtual machines, the example that I use is Ragnar Locker. It was first seen in December of 2019, and malicious actors targeted, service provider software and also RDP vulnerabilities. Once the attackers exploited that and gained access to your server or workstation, then they would work hard to gain admin rights across the domain. And they would then exfil your data and then use the native tools to laterally move, like PowerShell, admin shares, those types of things. Once they exfilled all of your data, they would create a group policy object and apply it to all of your machines, which would download and silently install an outdated version of VirtualBox Hypervisor from 2009 that was running a stripped down version of Windows XP SP3. And while the install was occurring silently on all of the PCs that the group policy was applied to, scripts would run to disable the autoplay notification, also delete all the shadow copies, and enumerate all of the disks connected to that particular device and write it to a local XML file. Once that was done, then another script would run and it would mount all of those enumerated drives into the virtual machine. And then the ransomware would start encrypting. And what's a really interesting tactic is all of that ransomware ran from inside of the VM. So it's in a location that the host's antivirus can't see, can't touch, and can't do anything about. So it's blind. And we've seen two other ransomware campaigns similar to this. Maze is another one. They actually partnered with the organization, criminal organization that did Ragnar Locker. So instead, the only real difference is instead of it being a XP SP3, they're doing a Windows 7 virtual machine, but all the rest of it's the same. So how can we prevent virtual attacks for our on-prem environment? Well, first and foremost, right, you've heard it time and time again. You want to patch your vulnerabilities and make sure your firmware is up to date. You also want to enable the host firewalls and do microsegmentation. VMware NSX allows for microsegmentation on their host machines in between the guest OSs. You can set up application whitelisting and block any unknown executables from running. You can also group your VMs by risk posture. So that way you can identify what hosts you need to apply stricter controls around. So if you have all of your crown jewels, like with us in healthcare, right, we have PHI. So if we have all of our systems running PHI on several different hosts, then we'll put more stringent controls around those hosts than we would, a test VMware server that we have a bogus Active Directory stood up in that doesn't have real data. And then harden your servers, both the guest and the host. You can use the CI security benchmarks. Those are fantastic. Or you could use the DoD STIGs. Those are also very effective. And then you can also do privileged access management and role-based access to define what users can make changes. And then something that a lot of people seem to have forgotten as a check is when you download that image or that file, compare the SHA against the trusted source for that image. And if it's different, then clearly that is not the right file for you. So how do we detect those on-prem attacks? Well, again, we can do application whitelisting and alert on the blocks. So an example of an event ID that you'd want to watch for is 4688, which is a file executed that's not on the whitelist. You also want to monitor for suspicious processes being spawned and perform user behavioral analytics between the VMs and also on your network. You can also ensure that you have your IDS or IPS, right, your intrusion detection or intrusion prevention systems. Make sure they have visibility in the traffic between the machines. Set up your antivirus to require a password to stop, disable, or uninstall it. And if that occurs, any of those things, alert on it. And then ultimately you want to send all of your logs to like a syslog server or a SIEM and have different alerts set up. So a couple of examples are event ID 7045, which is a service installed. So a good example of this is when I'm doing lateral movements or when I would do lateral movements previously during pen tests. PSExec is a great tool, and PSExec installs the PSExec service. And if you alert on that and monitor and alert on that, that definitely gives you an idea or a warning that something is happening. And then also 4674, an operation attempted on a privileged object. So that's on-prem. What about in the cloud? So I really tried to focus on some of the attacks that were cloud specific. There's a lot of overlap between on-prem and in the cloud, again, because you're virtualizing an entire server. So one example of difference is hypervisor denial of service, which accounts for nearly 70% of all malware attacks against the cloud hypervisors, Azure, AWS, Google's. 70% of the malware attacks is for denial of service against the hypervisor. Hyperjacking, so if you hear that, that's just Blue Pill with a new name. Again, that's the hypervisor rootkit. Exploiting live migrations. So if you migrate from one cloud provider to another, the cloud management system can actually be tricked into doing multiple migrations, which then causes a denial of service. And then VM escape. So what we were talking about with being able to break out and compromise the host or do VM hopping and compromise other hosts. It's the same concept as what's on-prem, and that actually accounts for over 13% of all malware attacks against the cloud. So how can we defend against those in the cloud? So some of the things that we're doing is we isolate our management ports of the virtual machine from the internet, and then we also review our rules that publish RDP and ensure that the source IP is not an asterisk or a wild card. We ensure that we specify where it can come from. We monitor security event logs for things like 4625, account failed to log in. And we also use just-in-time access for the virtual machines. So if you're not familiar with just-in-time, a good example of that is in Azure. You can create network security groups and have your virtual machines sitting inside of those. And as long as your account is added to the correct group for role-based access, you'll have access. So the firewall that's running through Windows Defender, if that's what you use, will keep the port closed. And when you initiate the connection, before it opens the port for you to be able to RDP in on the management side, Azure will check to ensure that you're a part of that group that has access to that VM. And if you are, then it opens the port for you. If you're not, then it leaves the port closed and the connection fails. Enable MFA for elevated accounts. Hopefully everybody has a separate account for their domain admin or server admins. And like us, we require MFA for anybody that's in an administrative role or a global admin on our Office 365 tenant. Configure network security groups, implement your cloud-based firewall, and keep your systems current. So how can we detect attacks against our cloud? Well, again, set up alerts for anomalies. There is cloud-based IDS, IPSs, and firewalls that you can enable and run, and send all of your logs and alerts to a SIEM or a cloud SIEM for event correlation. That has helped us significantly doing event correlation of our cloud assets. And also review your alerts regularly from the cloud infrastructure. So what about containers? We talked about virtual machines, right? That's where we virtualize the entire server and then install the application on top of the server. But again, containers are virtualizing the application itself, and then the application shares the underlying host kernel with the other applications. So some of the attacks against containers is a part of image development, right? Was the container files that were created, were they compiled completely, or is there exposed data? Going back to the Ragnar Locker, is there embedded malware? Are the images out of date? What about your source code repository? Is it poisoned? Was it hijacked? Or even your dependency repository? Is that compromised or running out of date software? And then you have the normal vectors of attack, right? Attacks on the container software vulnerabilities, right? Like Docker, Kubernetes. Those in themselves will have vulnerabilities. Misconfigured applications that allow open ports, we have that today. Vulnerabilities in the deployed application itself, we have those today. So how do we defend against those? Well, if you're running your Docker instance on Linux, you can use what's called Linux's user namespace. And that puts the container in isolation mode so that only system resources can access the container. You can also run mandatory access control tools like SE Linux, which stands for Security Enhanced Linux. Minimize third-party software usage. Mount your host file. Your host operating system file is read-only. And also scan the repositories for vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. Deploy application or integrated firewalls, and keep the underlying operating system patched. So if you think about containers and virtual machines for both on-prem and in the cloud, the attack surfaces are pretty similar, right? You have open ports, insecure protocols, the possibility of social engineering and phishing, right? Physical attacks, software vulnerabilities, network vulnerabilities, disgruntled employees. So with the virtual machines and containers being some of the more common methods of virtualization being used today, what other types of virtual environments could potentially be at risk? And one of those, looking to the future, is extended reality. So one example of extended reality, I know there was a talk earlier this morning, I believe, about extended reality. One of those is augmented reality. So if you've ever seen the Iron Man movies, or any movie that Iron Man is in, honestly, his heads-up display. So when he's looking out, he sees the real world, but then his display will put over the top of what he's looking at data or information about it. Virtual reality, Ready Player One, Jumanji, right? Those are Oculus headsets and many others. And then mixed reality. So if you go back to Iron Man, when he's down in his basement and he is got the Iron Man outfit on display in his hologram, and he starts pulling off pieces of the armor, and he puts his arm down into one of the sleeves and then rotates his arm, and the mixed reality image rotates with him. That's an example of mixed reality. So comparing extended reality attack surfaces to the traditional, right, we have all of the same things that traditional attacks can come in on, right? We have social networks, web, through applications. But what's crazy is with extended reality, that attack surface now extends into your living room, right? Your VR headset, your Samsung display, your TV, your smart TV. So what are some examples of extended reality attacks? Now, these are going off of the assumption that the home PC is already compromised. And let's be honest, that's not a much of a stretch, right? It's relatively easy to compromise a large majority of people's home PCs. So these attacks were discovered by researchers at New Haven University in Connecticut. And we're going to talk through each one of these as we progress through the slides. So the first type of attack is a tracker attack. Look at exactly where you are in your room, in your house. A chaperone attack, human joystick attack, an overlay attack, and now there's also a replicating worm that can infect users as soon as another user enters a VR room with somebody that has the worm on their device, on their headset anyway. So it's a completely new attack vector. So the tracker attack is very similar to what attackers do today with webcams. They turn them on. Even if the user has them disabled, they can still turn them on and see where you are in your house, what's going on in the room around you. They can also turn on the microphone and eavesdrop and then stream the video and the sound back to them. The chaperone attack. So anytime that you start a virtual reality session, you have to define a boundary around you, a boundary for safety. And what these researchers found is that they could actually expand the boundary, shrink the boundary, or just make it completely go away. Now, not related to hacking, but unfortunately, there has been one death related to virtual reality. There's a 44-year-old male in Russia that was had his VR headset on, and he was walking through the game or the program that he was using, and he ended up tripping over an object in his apartment that was inside of his boundary, fell through a glass table, and died before paramedics could get to him. So if you think of something like that can happen, what about if the boundary can be completely turned off or expanded? So joystick attacks. Now, researchers were able to move the person with the VR headset where they wanted them to go. And the person with the VR headset on didn't know that they were moving more than what they thought. So if you look at the top squares, right, the green plus sign is where the person with the goggles, with the headset started. And the red circle is where the researchers wanted that person to go to. If you look at the bottom squares, that is where the person with the headset on, where they thought they moved, and where the VR headset showed that they moved when it tracked them. So again, researchers could move the person to where they wanted them to be, the person to where they wanted them to be without the person even knowing. Now, extended reality overlays, this is ransomware, right? The researchers were able to perform overlay attacks on different brands of VR headsets and not infect them with malware because they didn't want to waste the money, but they were able to do overlay attacks. So, this is exactly like what we see today in our existing cyber and computing world. Now, what about the third party or the vendor attacks? So this error is an example of when a Facebook employee forgot to update a firmware certificate. It caused all of the Oculus Quest or Oculus headsets to basically be bricked for 24 hours. So what happens if the application vendors are breached and malware is installed there, or Facebook or Microsoft or whoever that headset manufacturer is? What kind of defenses are there for extended reality? Well, unfortunately, there's not really any, not at this time, because it's still relatively new. So what can we do? We can inform users of the privacy risks, harassment, stalking, risk to minors. We can also do security and privacy awareness education. The manufacturers of the goggles and the software are starting to look at how to protect our identities. So what happens if somebody logs in as me, or if I log in as somebody else? The developers for the applications and the software are starting to validate the input from the code that's coming in to the goggles. And then they're also starting to validate the output that's occurring on the goggles for installation or movement to make sure that it's not malicious. And then going back to that worm that can spread through VR rooms, user interaction protection. So how do those manufacturers protect shared environments? One of the things that is really cool is you can actually participate in an extended reality bug bounty program. You can volunteer and sign up and then do pen testing against your virtual, your VR goggles or your augmented reality or your whatever the extended reality platform is that you have access to. And as you find the bugs or the vulnerabilities, you can turn them in, and then they get sent off to the vendor or the application coders, developers, for them to fix the vulnerabilities. So some things to consider with extended reality attacks. There's currently no regulations or laws that protect extended reality today. Cyberspace or cybersecurity still appears to be an afterthought, as it unfortunately always is. How would we be able to tell if one of those chaperone attacks was an accident or if it was malicious intent? Because we don't have the digital forensics for extended reality environments today to be able to tell. And what if third party or vendors were breached? So again, I try to make these actionable. So what are some of the things that you can do for your virtual environments when you get back to work? Well, the first one would be to inventory what roles and functions that you have running in your virtual environments so that you can see are all my critical devices, critical roles running across multiple host boxes, or are they consolidated? Enable monitoring of traffic between the virtual machines on the hosts. You can use NetFlow, virtual IDS, IPS, the firewall. VMware NSX has that capability. ESXi, Hyper-V, they all support NetFlow. You can ensure that your virtual machines and hosts are patched on a regular basis. And as a part of patching them, you should include taking snapshots of them and then copying the snapshots off to an air-gapped environment. Set up logs and alerting to go to your SIEM so that you can do event correlation and alerting. And then start performing identity governance on the hosts and the VMs. So identify who has access and what level of access do they have. Do they really need it? Chances are there's permission creep going on in your environment, just like every other environment. And some of the event IDs, SANS has a fantastic list of event IDs that you would want to alert on. This is just some of them. But again, right, if you look at 7045, that's a service was installed on the system, PSExec. If you look at 4720 and 4722, an account was created and enabled. Who should really be creating local accounts on servers and workstations and putting them in the local admin group? And, disabling the firewall, event ID 2003. So again, SANS has a fantastic list. This is just a subset of those. At this time, we can open it up for questions if there is any.
Hi, Chris. I've been monitoring the Q&A, and it looks like there is nothing in there.
Okay.
Easy peasy for you.
And there's my sources.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. You did a great job. Thank you, Chris, and special thanks to Nexagen, who is our featured sponsor for this session. I ask you all to remember to complete the survey that's in the description for this session in the My Agenda link. We're going to have a 15-minute break, or it looks like 20-ish minute break until 3:45 when the last session starts. So come back then. And then the code for this session is ARTS. That's ARTS. And now we'll go to our 15-minute break. Thank you all.
Thank you.